So it's my delight and pleasure to introduce Simeon, my very close colleague from the Faculty of Divinity here at the University of Cambridge. Simeon is professor of Christian theology at the Faculty of Divinity. His research brings together classical Christian theological themes, especially the Holy Spirit and the doctrine of sin at the moment, in dialogue with empirical research, especially from the human sciences. Simeon is the author of The Holy Spirit and Christian Experience, most recently, a book published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And he has also published on the contributions of affect theory and cognitive science to theology, the place of experience and emotion in Christian life, as well as the theological legacy of the Reformation. So your work has really covered spanning many of the topics that will be of interest to us here. His talk today is entitled Are Doctrines Empirically Verifiable? Theology, Theory, and Human Sciences. We're very much looking forward to learn from you today, Simeon. Please join me in welcoming the speakers.
Thank you very much, Hui, and thank you all for coming. It's just a delight to be here and to get to talk about this this material with the audience, with all of you here at the Faraday Institute. I live about 200 meters that way, and I work about 400 meters that way, so it's wonderful to be here. My paper today comes essentially out of a set of reflections on a grant. I had a project on theology and psychological science over a number of years. And these are some reflections, I guess, on the relation between theology and I guess especially what psychological science can offer. And so that's sort of where this is coming from. So I want to talk about the relationship between Christian doctrines on the one hand and the findings of empirical research into Christian experiences and Christian practices on the other. So what role, if any, should findings from research in the human sciences play in how we think about and develop Christian doctrinal claims? For example, can doctrinal claims about human nature or some dimension of human nature be verified or falsified through empirical observation of human beings and what they do? Theology is very concerned with making claims about human nature. In a moment, I want to present a series of kind of test cases to help us explore these questions and to explain in more detail the sorts of things I have in mind. But first, I thought it might be useful to give a little background about where I'm coming from and why, as a theologian, I'm interested in these kinds of questions. The reason I'm interested in the relationship between empirical research and theology is that I've spent a good deal of my career trying to show theologians why we need to take Christian experience seriously in theology, and indeed showing how, historically speaking, theologians have always taken experience seriously in some form or other. There is a temptation in theology to think that if we've just said what the Bible says, what we think the Bible says, or what church tradition says, then we've done our jobs as theologians. And what I've tried to argue instead is that it's no good thinking we found answers to theological questions, no good just stating the doctrines, if we can't also give a good account of how our theological answers play out with real people in real churches and in real life. So in my book, The Holy Spirit and Christian Experience, that Hui just mentioned, I asked questions like these. What effects do theological doctrines have on what people experience and feel in their religious life? If you believe in predestination, that has certain experiential consequences or affordances that a different kind of belief might have, for example. Likewise, how has Christian experience informed how doctrines have developed in the past? And what are the ways that theology can easily go wrong when it doesn't take these kinds of questions about how theology gets traction in people's lives seriously? Now, the reason these questions relate to empirical research in areas like the psychological sciences is that the latter are, of course, formal academic ways of examining and learning from human experience. So if I'm right that theology needs to pay attention to Christian experience, then that leads to being interested in what theology can learn from various kinds of empirical study. And that's why, as a theologian, I personally have been quite interested in such research over the years, especially in psychological research. In the remainder of the paper, I'm going to make a series of arguments and observations. First, I'm going to give an example that I think illustrates the real challenges involved in bringing resources from empirical research from the human sciences to bear in our thinking about Christian doctrines. Then I'm going to draw on an analogy from the philosophy of science to show how theological doctrines are not just simple truth claims that exist in a kind of isolation, but are more like tapestries woven together from a range of different smaller ideas. Understanding the nature of doctrines in this way, we'll start to have a clearer idea of what scientific findings about human beings can and also cannot do in our theological thinking. I'm then going to propose a way of thinking about empirical work in theology as a form of what I call theory. And I'll run this way of thinking through some examples to see how it can help us see its value for doctrinal reflection. Finally, I'll bring all this together to show how it helps us to analyze and explore one doctrine in particular, the one I'm writing about these days, the doctrine of original sin. So I want to begin our discussion by exploring a specific example. In this example, the kind of empirical work I'm going to be looking at is work drawn from psychological and cognitive sciences. So if we're asking ourselves, how might psychological research be useful for theologians? A natural thing to do might be to look for places where theologians have historically made claims about human psychology, and then to assess those claims in light of empirical psychological findings. Theologians, in fact, quite often have made claims about human motivation and human behavior, claims that we might think of as theological psychology. Given this, if in such a case, present-day empirical psychological research seems to be at odds with a given bit of theological psychology, then it might make sense to argue that theologians now have an obligation to alter or update their anthropological claims, their claims about human beings, in light of the science. So this is a way, at least in theory, that empirical research could affect our doctrinal claims about human nature. Although such a scenario might seem from the outside to be plausible enough, I would argue that it's actually extremely difficult to do this successfully. So difficult indeed that this should not be, in fact, the main paradigm for engagement between theology and the human sciences. So here's my example. In 1521, the Lutheran reformer Philip Melanchthon made a set of highly influential claims that I think fall squarely in the domain of theological psychology. Melanchthon, as some of you will know, was Martin Luther's right-hand man in the 16th century. He was also, in an important sense, the first Protestant systematic theologian. His theology has been enormously influential. In a book he wrote in 1521 called the Loci Communes, Melanchthon made the following assertion about what he calls human nature. We, theologians, divide man into two parts, where there is in him a cognitive faculty, and there's also a faculty by which he either follows or flees the things he's come to know. The cognitive faculty is that by which we discern through the senses, understand, think, compare, and deduce. The faculty from which the affections arise, by contrast, is that by which we either turn away from or pursue the things known, and this faculty is sometimes called will, sometimes affection, and sometimes appetite. So what Melanchthon is claiming here, in other words, is that human beings have two innate capacities or faculties that are theologically important. A rational faculty, which determines what we know, and an affective faculty, which determines what we do and how we respond, or how we respond to what reason reveals to us. Melanchthon then goes on to deploy this simple picture to articulate what he takes to be one of the most important differences between Protestant theology and medieval Catholic scholastic theology. He says that when push comes to shove on matters that are morally and spiritually significant, it is the affective faculty that drives the ship. The cognitive or rational faculty is not capable of successfully overcoming strong feeling and strong desire. That's a key claim he makes. What Melanchthon's doing here is translating specific Protestant ideas about what theologians call the bondage of the will, which is the idea that the human will is not capable of choosing the good, even if it knows the good it should be doing, apart from the grace of God. He's translating that into the language of medieval theology. For Melanchthon, we are creatures above all of affect, of emotion and desire. And in his view, our knowledge and our rational deliberations are unlikely to have much meaningful effect on our behavior when they come into conflict with emotion and desire. It's why no one ever gets persuaded of a political position that they don't already hold. So what we have here basically is a theological theory about human motivation and it's one that has been hugely influential for later reflection on the famous doctrine of justification by faith. And it's been influential not just for Lutherans. For example, Melanchthon's theology of justification and affect is one of the key theological influences behind the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. So in other words, what Melanchthon is saying is not just some side comment, it's a part of a very important set of doctrinal claims in the history of Protestant theology. So shortly here, a modern psychologist might usefully weigh in assessing the contemporary validity or value of Melanchthon's claim. Such a psychologist might look at Melanchthon's picture and say, well, actually, this account of human nature is in many ways obsolete. Thanks to a variety of dimensions of modern psychological research, we now know a lot more about the relation between affect and cognition than we did then. And a strict distinction between a reasoning faculty and a feeling faculty just can't be maintained anymore. For example, we now know that the operations Melanchthon attributes to what he calls the cognitive or rational faculty are in fact constantly drawing in complex ways on feeling to inform our judgments, as in the phenomenon of what psychologists call mood congruent cognition, that our thinking reflects our mood in various complex ways. At the same time, psychological research now counts it as well established that emotions, in contrast to mood states, involve cognitive appraisal as a defining feature, to quote one recent definition, and therefore cannot occur apart from cognitive judgments of some kind about an external object of perception. The result is that it's widely recognized now that there's not such a clear-cut distinction between reasoning and feeling, as Melanchthon seems to be implying. Feeling very often involves cognitive judgments. Cognitive judgments are affected by feeling, and it's much more complicated even than that. We likewise now have good reasons to think that it's far too simple to lump all feeling and desiring into a single faculty, as Melanchthon does. Psychologists usually distinguish now, for example, between emotion, mood, and core affect. It's based on things like the duration of the affective experience in question, or whether or not it seems to have an immediate object of perception that elicits it. So feeling, it seems, is highly complex, more so than Melanchthon's characterization has implied. So our theologian, Philip Melanchthon, has made a simplistic and reductive psychological claim on the basis of pre-modern psychology, not his fault, and well-regarded contemporary empirical research would seem to contest his claim on a number of fronts. Surely, the theologically interested psychologist might think the way to proceed now is for the theologian to drop the Melanchthonian picture of the faculties and to update it with something that more closely approximates contemporary research. Hear the but coming. Alas, things unfortunately are not so simple, not on either side. To start with, we need to recognize that it's a significant mistake to see Melanchthon as making exactly the same kind of claim that is being made in the literature on the psychology of emotion. Although Melanchthon is willing to support his position on the relation between affect and intellect through appeal to sort of phenomenological experience at various points, his overall claim is profoundly misunderstood if it is simply reduced to that dimension of his argument. In other words, Melanchthon is not just making a psychological claim, he's also making a theological claim. And that means that its persuasiveness, its force as a doctrinal claim, is grounded in many other kinds of argument beyond the sheerly empirical. So in this particular case, his argument is built out of a complex ecosystem of theological influences, factors, and data points. It's built, for example, out of a conviction that this position best reflects what Paul says about the law and human nature in texts like Romans 7 and Galatians 5. In other words, he's drawing on an inference from the very clear Pauline idea that mere knowledge of the law does not produce the ability to do what the law says. He's drawing a larger sort of theory, in part out of that kind of concept within Paul. His position is also built out of pastoral considerations that emerged powerfully in late medieval Western culture in light of the medieval penitential system, a concern that alternative accounts, in other words, of the relationship between reason and the will in late medieval Catholic theology had led to a widespread spirituality of guilt and fear that had eclipsed for many Christians belief in God's love and grace for them. That's, of course, a contestable claim, but that's a very significant part of the sort of the texture of argument that the Protestants are making in this kind of front. So there's a pastoral experiential claim there. And Melanchthon's position also takes for granted the very great theological authority of St. Augustine, something agreed upon by both Protestants and Catholics, then as now, and especially Augustine's extended and authoritative set of reflections on sin and desire in the course of the Pelagian controversy in the 5th century. Most importantly, perhaps, Melanchthon's account of the relationship between cognition and desire is also deeply tied to a range of what we might call systematic theological considerations, convictions to do with Christology, theology of the sacraments, and the nature of grace, each of which has its own distinct theological rationale and support, and each of which is in turn built out of its own web of scriptural evidence, philosophical argument, and reflection on pastoral experience. For example, a key dimension of early Christian reflection on the importance of being able to assert that Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine was reflection on the problematic nature of human passions and desires, which had become distorted under the conditions of the fall and required healing through Christ's taking on of human nature. So his claims are connected to a very long set of arguments that go right back to core Christological concerns. Altogether, what this means is that Melanchthon's claims about human willing and desiring are not just empirical or pastoral claims. They are also implications of other positions that Melanchthon is committed to on non-empirical grounds, and that nevertheless have theological force. It's not an easy thing to build up a full field dogmatic, biblical, and pastoral picture of how something like Christian salvation works, such as we have in the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone. Of course, it's not the only one, but it's a formidable one. To think that a theologian should just drop all of these other considerations on a dime because of some findings from psychological research over the past 20 years or so is to misunderstand the way that theological claims are always parts of highly complex ecologies of thought developed over very long time frames and in response to a wide range of pressures, and are furthermore grounded in complex commitments to additional sources of theological authority. So it is true that Melanchthon's account is partially supported by empirical arguments. He makes such arguments. And he himself was, in fact, highly attentive to the best science of his day. He wrote 2 different commentaries on Aristotle's De Anima that were considered sort of scientific textbooks at the time. Indeed, I think he would want to take seriously the findings of current research. He'd be very interested. It would be, but for him, such research would just be one part of a larger ecosystem of theological and anthropological ideas, and by no means a straightforward defeater for his claims. So here we see just how difficult it is for empirical findings to be a simple or straightforward verifier or falsifier of doctrinal positions, even positions that are clearly psychological in nature, at least in part. So the gap between theological claims and empirical psychological research isn't just about the complex nature of doctrinal claims. There's also a problem on the empirical side. And here I'm much more of an amateur than many of you in this room, but so we'll see what you think about what I say. One crucial thing I've learned over several years of working quite closely with psychological scientists on a Templeton grant is something that I think is usually quite obvious to working scientists, but not at all obvious to theologians. And this is the fact that the kinds of claims that psychological scientists make about how human beings work or what they're like are actually highly dynamic and highly provisional. So when a psychologist says something like, cognition is highly integrated with affectivity in particular ways, what they really mean is something like the following, at least from a theologian's perspective. Our best current way of narrating a provisional set of data that is constantly being updated and revised, and which may have its mistakes embedded in it, seems to indicate that some dimension of what we are currently calling affectivity seems to be involved with certain processes that we currently have decent reasons to file under the label cognition. So to put it another way, psychological models and psychological theories always have an implicit sort of epistemological asterisk next to them. All you have to do is read successive editions of a general text like, say, Lisa Feldman Barrett and Michael Lewis's Handbook of Emotions, currently in its 4th edition, super dated because it's 2016. So, that's ancient history now in psychology. We just have to look at the sort of these succeeding editions of handbooks to see how major assumptions and models in psychological science are constantly changing and being updated, and in some cases superseded. This dynamic quality of scientific knowledge production is something I think that scientists, from what I can tell, take for granted, but that theologians have a hard time seeing. Experimental psychology in particular is a very young field, and its theories are constantly changing and updating. Cognition research, for example, is overwhelmingly based on relatively small studies, usually of undergraduate students, since they're the population psychologists have easiest access to. And the large majority of this research takes place in the Western developed world. And even within that, there are all kinds of problems around replicability of key findings. From what I hear, at least when I'm told, the basic point seems to be true of experimental findings in science more generally, however. This is part of what the philosopher of science Willard Quine famously showed when he showed that scientific theories are, quote, always underdetermined by data. In other words, there will always be multiple ways of accounting for the same empirical data. In any case, what this means is that the psychological claims about human beings and what they are like are not the sort of straightforward philosophical assertions about the nature of reality that theologians tend to be interested in. What they are primarily are useful labels for interpreting disparate and limited data in order to generate new testable research hypotheses. As the physicist David Merman observes, knowledge in science is gained much less by singular experiments than most non-sense scientists tend to realize. It's gained rather by gradual accumulations of lots of pieces of interesting but slightly ambiguous evidence, each of which on its own may not mean very much, but all of which together can create a very robust and reliable picture of how things are. So Merman gives a helpful analogy for this aspect of how scientific progress works. He calls the science around a particular theory or model a tapestry that is woven of many different strands. The mistake is to give too much weight to one particular strand. Even if one particular strand proves weak or thin, we have to pay attention to everything else that holds the tapestry together, a bit like what I was saying about theology. According to Merman, we need to, quote, acknowledge that an enormous multiplicity of strands of evidence, many of them weak and ambiguous, can nevertheless make a coherent, logical bond whose strength is enormous. The upshot of all this is that theologians like myself do well to take even relatively established claims in empirical psychological research with a certain grain of salt. Such claims are nearly always based on something empirical and real, but there's also a larger than expected gap between the data itself and the stories scientists tell, especially in general handbooks and so on, about that data. And that's fine. It's the way science works. But it also means it's very easy for theologians to misunderstand the epistemic force of empirical claims about human nature and human experience. And it's easy for theologians to attribute substantially more epistemic authority to such claims than scientists themselves do, or at least a different kind of epistemic authority. So am I just saying no, doctrines are not empirically verifiable? Well, we'll see. Does all this mean that theologians shouldn't try to learn from the sciences or from empirical research of any kind? No, I definitely don't think so. Not at all. In the remainder of this paper, I want to suggest two ways that research in the human sciences can be genuinely valuable for theologians. They are more modest than the scientific research now proves that Melanchthon was wrong paradigm, but I still think they have a lot to offer. What I want to suggest today is that theologians make the best and most helpful use of scientific findings, at least in the human sciences, not by viewing them as a repository of hard information about human nature, but rather as a repository of interesting theory about human nature. Here I'm using the term theory the way that critical theorists use it, which is to say to refer to what we might call a pragmatically useful hermeneutical lens, interpretive lens. Empirical findings, analyses, and concepts can give us a new lens for looking at and interpreting phenomena that we, theologians, are already quite interested in looking at for our own theological reasons. Psychologists, for example, think a lot about things that theologians also think about, things like willing and reasoning and social relationships. But they do so from a perspective that is, I would say, interestingly orthogonal to that of theologians. Psych methods, and also the implicit values and goals that shape psychology as a discipline, mean that psychologists often notice things that theologians don't. The result is that the more theologians steep themselves in this research, the more likely they are to notice things they didn't notice before, and also to realize that certain operating assumptions that theologians often work with are actually kind of weird and worth interrogating. So the idea of using empirical research as a theory or a useful hermeneutical lens in theology has two main dimensions as I see it. The first is that as you become more familiar with psychological ideas and categories, you will gain what I think of as an interesting new conceptual toolbox as a theologian. A toolbox of certain kinds of questions that it did not previously occur to you to ask, or of new concepts for focusing your theological interest in analysis. I'll give some examples in just a moment. The second benefit of drawing on empirical research as theory is that empirical perspectives are especially helpful at exposing or illuminating assumptions that theologians make without realizing they are making them, or without realizing they are not as obviously true as the theologian has supposed. So, for example, the more you learn to think like a psychologist, the more you realize that theologians are often making theological claims without realizing it. Things that seem like common sense and therefore don't feel like they need to be interrogated or justified from a theological perspective. In other words, you could say there's a lot of what we might call folk psychology at work in what theologians say and how they make arguments, especially in the domain of theological anthropology. So one example that I've written about before has to do with the well-known critique of the doctrine of justification by faith, the sort of classic Protestant idea that you're saved by faith alone, not by anything you do. The idea that this doctrine is a legal fiction. There's a long-standing critique that doctrine is a legal fiction, which is to say that it basically lets you off the hook through like moving the abacus in the sky. So God sort of pretends that you're different than you are. It's a legal fiction. This is basically this critique goes back to the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the Catholic response to the Reformation. According to John Milbank, my old colleague at the University of Nottingham, the doctrine of forensic justification amounts to nothing more than a blind calculus, an extrinsicist and judicial concept of grace, he says, that need make no essential experiential difference to the human subject. He thinks that basically if you can believe in that you're saved without it making any difference to you at all, that you just be exactly the same person. It's an entirely conceptual, rationalized doctrine that's unrelated to human experience. Very common argument. In making this claim about this doctrine being a kind of abstract propositionalism that is divorced from real embodied Christian experience, Milbank is actually making certain psychological assumptions about the relationship between theological concepts about our relationship with God, the concepts we have about our relationship with God, and emotional experience of that relationship. Specifically, Milbank is assuming that faith alone, so in this case, a certain set of beliefs about the nature and significance of Christ's work, he thinks that's highly unlikely to have significant emotional effects on the person of faith. Now, these are assumptions that can be usefully interrogated from the perspective of current research in the psychology of emotion. Turns out, as I've shown elsewhere, the psych research actually has very little trouble with the idea that new information about a major social relationship, your relationship with God, that he doesn't judge you anymore, for example, that your relationship with God is restored, he's not standing in judgment over you. The idea that might help mediate emotionally salient changes in how you perceive that relationship, as in have an emotional effect, is actually not at all a hard thing to be able to say or interpret from a psychological perspective, even if from Milbank's folk psychology, it's something that shouldn't happen. Now, importantly, the psych work here isn't necessarily proving anything either way about justification itself. The larger theological claims Milbank is making about the nature of grace are too complex to reduce to their psychological assumptions, and the psych work itself is too limited and provisional to constitute some kind of hard proof about the relationship between theological concepts and emotions. But what attending to the psych work, as I'm calling it, does is help us to A, notice when theologians are making psychological claims or assumptions without realizing it, and B, it helps us to usefully disrupt a widely accepted theological narrative about the implausibility of the doctrine of justification today. So psych work can help us to identify, examine, and critically question psychological claims that theologians are already implicitly or explicitly making. To borrow a term from the philosophy of science, another way to put this is that empirical work can be particularly useful for drawing attention to auxiliary hypotheses about human nature or about how the world works that undergird doctrinal claims, the implicit assumptions. Another example I've written about is how theologians talk about what we often call individualistic theories of salvation. There's a widespread trope in soteriological work over the last 40 years of referring to classical Protestant accounts of salvation as problematically individualistic. Many of you will no doubt have come across this. Very often, this critique is glossed by talking about how focus on personal guilt in theologies of salvation leads us to look inwards rather than outwards, so that these individualistic doctrines of salvation are focused entirely on guilt, and they're therefore inwardly focused and individualistic. Over and over, soteriology, and this comes at the expense of worrying about others or the state of the world. Over and over, soteriological individualism is specified with reference to its focus on what Christopher Stendahl, biblical scholar, for example, calls introspective awareness of sin and guilt. In other words, justification by faith, it is often assumed, is a self-centered doctrine focused on personal guilt. which results in what Tom Wright calls inward-looking soteriologies that communicate to Christians the belief that the whole of Christian truth is all about me and my salvation. That's Tom's critique of this. When you read up on current social psychological work on emotion, and especially the emotion of guilt, however, this way of putting things comes across as distinctly odd. From a psychological perspective, most emotions are highly social. As Agneta Fisher puts it, quote, emotions are experienced and expressed in social contexts, and they help us to deal with the challenges posed by the social environment. Amongst these, some emotions seem to serve what psychologists call an affiliation function. These help, in Fisher's words, to establish or maintain cooperative and harmonious relationships with other individuals or social groups. So from a social psychology perspective, this is just what the experience of guilt is. Guilt is a quintessentially social emotion whose function is to point you outside of yourself to others by incentivizing you to repair broken social relations. In other words, far from being an individualistic and navel-gazing emotional state, when guilt, at least when it's functioning correctly, is an outward-looking emotion whose main function seems to be to promote and maintain sociality. So from a social psych perspective, worrying about religious guilt is in fact a deeply social experience. It just happens to be that the other party in the social relation is God. That's what's different about it, rather than it's not being social. Note once again, in itself, this observation doesn't prove anything either way about which soteriologies we should affirm as theologians. But it does help us to see a different but compelling perspective on the topic at hand. And also helps us to notice auxiliary assumptions theologians are making without realizing it, for example, about the nature of guilt, but on which much of the force of the argument actually depends. So in this case, the assumption that focusing on experience of guilt in relation to God in Christian practice is an intrinsically individualistic and antisocial thing to do. And here the psych work also adds to our conceptual toolbox. Theologians tend to think of emotions as things individuals experience, or the individual subjectivity discourse in theology. But the psych perspective helps us to see that it makes just as much sense to view emotion as social phenomena that help foster social connections. So my argument is that in a case like this, the empirical work and research and analysis is functioning as a repository of useful ideas and perspectives that theologians can draw upon to help them see things about topics they are interested in that they didn't see before. This is what I meant before in calling it a theory. And in this particular case, I have to say, it doesn't really matter that much either way about what empirical work stands behind psychological conceptions of guilt as an inherently social emotion. The point here is rather that this is simply a different and plausible way of looking at the same material, guilt experience in its relation to sociality, and that this way of seeing the material didn't occur to theologians on our own, in our own discursive field, even though it immediately makes sense, a lot of sense, once a psychologist points it out to you. What I particularly like about this theory perspective on the relationship between theology and science is that it doesn't operate in competition with theological approaches. It just helps us to see new and different things about topics we are already interested in for theological reasons. The result is that this approach to empirically engaged theology is able to navigate the gap between empirical findings and theological doctrines successfully. There's no threat either of psychological reduction of theological arguments on the one hand, and there's no need to be too anxious about the significant provisionality of empirical claims on the other. Well, I've covered a good deal of ground at this point, but I want to look at one more case study before I conclude. I'll do a sort of short version of it. I'm particularly interested in right now is the doctrine of original sin. Some of you may be familiar, if you aren't, you should be, because it's really interesting, with Reinhold Niebuhr's famous quote about original sin. He said, the doctrine of original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian faith. And G.K. Chesterton said something quite similar. Now, there's a lot we could say about original sin, but before we can take a stab at analyzing this Niebuhr's claim, let me just give a brief sketch of the tapestry of the doctrine of sin. For present purposes, a good definition of the doctrine of original sin is that it refers to a wrongness or disorder that has become intrinsic to human nature, leading to death, which cannot be put right without the intervention of God. So widely agreed, that's East, West, Protestant, Catholic. You could agree with that. Original sin, fallenness, corruption, these are all traditional theological names for a condition of innate conflictedness or damage in human beings that we are not able to escape on our own powers. Behind this lies a very rich doctrinal tapestry. Once again, you'll find this with traditional doctrines. So it has a trio of scriptural texts: Genesis 3, the fall narrative, Psalm 51, this claim that we are born in sin, Paul's discussions of the effects of Adam's fall and its consequences for humanity in Romans 5. Those are the sort of key texts for this doctrine. Also important are philosophical ideas about freedom and responsibility, about what sort of creature you have to be capable of sinning, which means a creature with a will. Traditionally, the sacrament of baptism has been very important for thinking about sin. Christology has been important, and so on. So it turns out that a lot of Christian doctrines, as well as ethics, don't make a great deal of sense without the doctrine of original sin. But part of the claim of original sin seems to be kind of, as it were, an empirical one, or a potentially verifiable one. The claim is that the original sin has experiential effects on human beings. It specifically affects on our will, our disordered wills and desires, and affects on our ability to see the world clearly. It's called the noetic effects of sin. We don't see the world or each other as they really are. It's hard to see things rightly. So a lot of the doctrine of original sin's credibility of the centuries has been connected to the fact that it seems to make sense of just how damaged human beings are. But does this mean the doctrine is empirically verifiable? Well, I want to look at just one very quick example, the example of cognitive bias, which you might have heard about from psychology. Cognitive bias refers to various ways that our brains operate in such a way that we come to less than fully rational conclusions. Often these operations seem to have some kind of adaptive function, but in any case, usually when you hear about cognitive bias today, it's in the context of some article on why political opinions are difficult to change or why human beings always buy high and sell low in investing. But you could also say that maybe cognitive bias is a scientific language for empirically verifiable, hardwired biological facts of human selfishness and irrationality. So just one example I'll give is what's called self-serving bias. The psychologist Dave Myers puts it this way. Many dozens of experiments have found that people accept credit when told they have succeeded. They attribute the success to their ability and effort, but they attribute failure to external factors, such as bad luck or the problem's inherent impossibility. Similarly, in explaining their victories, athletes commonly credit themselves, but they attribute losses to something else. Bad breaks, bad referee calls, the other team worked hard or played dirty or whatever it might be. So when we say that human beings exhibit self-serving bias, we're referring to the fact that we tend strongly to attribute good things that happen to us to our own efficacy and bad things to external factors. Now, these allow us to maintain a view that we ourselves are thoughtful people who are basically wise and good, even if there's evidence to the contrary. Once upon a time, we would have called this a clear instance of the noetic effects of sin, the effects of sin on our ability to see the world clearly, a proneness to misperceiving the world in a way that serves the needs of the self at the expense of the truth. Now we call it self-serving bias. So here's the question. Does the existence of a bias like this and the empirical evidence for it, does it mean that self-serving biases prove the truth of the claim of the doctrine of original sin? I think we can say a few things as I wrap up. First, they're not a proof, not in themselves. One can believe that these biases are real without interpreting them as religiously significant, for example. Second, our current account of these biases are based in provisional science that is subject to revision. There's a non-trivial chance, in other words, that we will understand these phenomena quite differently in 30 years than we do now. This means that, plausible that they are, we must hold these accounts a little lightly. On the other hand, however, cognitive bias research does seem to provide some sort of support for the doctrine of original sin, in that these are exactly the sorts of things you would expect or predict would characterize people who have fallen minds and disordered and self-oriented desires. In particular, the fact that such biases are normally invisible to us and precede conscious processes, again, is consistent with the idea of a sin nature, sin as a condition we are born into, rather than just as something we do from time to time. So I think this kind of work is interesting because it does make a case, just a little bit of a case, for the plausibility of something like the doctrine of original sin in a world that doesn't believe in the doctrine of original sin anymore. It sort of shows that it's consistent with things that we actually do already believe, but don't think of in terms of sin. It also helps expose auxiliary assumptions in theological claims about the contemporary plausibility of the doctrine. And finally, I just want to say that the doctrine of original sin doesn't depend on findings about cognitive bias. It's built out of many other factors, quite a few of which are more important from a theological perspective than this kind of experiential data. So to answer Niebuhr's question, or my question in the paper, are doctrines empirically verifiable? I'd say Niebuhr is a little bit right that original sin is an empirically verifiable doctrine, but he's not really right. So it's highly unlikely, I've argued, that empirical work will falsify a doctrine directly, just as it is unlikely for a single outlier inexplicable by a scientific theory to falsify that theory by itself. But empirical work remains valuable for reflection on Christian doctrines, especially if we understand it as a repository of theory rather than a collection of clear and immutable facts. It can provide a starting point for asking good questions of doctrines. It can contribute to or take away from the plausibility of a doctrine or a doctrinal claim. We saw this in these various examples. Finally, as theory, empirical research can help us to see things from new angles, including by surfacing undefended and under-theorized auxiliary hypotheses. Finally, however, though, I think, so empirical work, I think for all its limitations, remains an instrument for letting reality, as it were, talk back to us in theology for all its limitations. But I do think, finally, that a tapestry model of doctrines that, as I've been discussing, indicates that we should be much more cautious than we sometimes are in claiming that X or Y, new discovery or phenomenon, invalidates a traditional doctrinal claim. All too often, what we discover is that the problem was less with the doctrine than with our understanding of it or the assumptions that we brought to it without realizing. Thank you.
I had my first degree in theoretical physics, and you have now made me think maybe I should become a theoretical theologian. Those very precise sense that you've just sketched out for us today.
So thank you for your talk. I'd just like to ask, so one of your points was that a lot of the evidence in psychology doesn't have the same weighting, in a sense that theories are the best way we describe the evidence that we have. But in some areas of science which are more well established, so I would say things like theory of gravity or the theory of climate change, there's a growing body of evidence that, in a sense, makes these theories, in a sense, act more like incontrovertible facts than explainable heuristics. Do you think this would eventually be the case for cognitive psychology as well?
It's a great question. Thank you. So I definitely think that what I'm saying is vastly more straightforwardly true in the human sciences than in other domains of science. Though the more you read in the philosophy of science, the more you realize that it's a little more complicated than I had assumed, even in something like physics. But I think, so I wouldn't want this to be sort of a God of the gaps kind of thing, where I think we are so far from getting to the kind of level of detailed knowledge and specificity in the cognitive sciences where this would be the kind of a real problem. So I'm not too worried about it happening for quite a while. I think we're just really, really far off, partly because human cognition, human psychology is about the most complex phenomenon in the universe. But if we could get further and make certain kinds of, I think in principle, I would want theology should take seriously these kinds of findings. But even so, even if it were rock hard evidence of some kind about some feature of some structural feature of human cognition or something like that has theological relevance, it would still, a theologian to be persuaded would still need to hold it together with various other forms of, there are different kinds of epistemic authority that have to be taken into account. But I think we're a long way.
I would take the question from the gentleman at the back, and then I will go online. Thank you very much. I want to tackle a slightly from a different angle. You talked about theory. There's a lot of psychological research into psychological practice, in other words, psychotherapy. And as you probably would know, most of that research supports Ignatian technique. In fact, a lot of psychologists say that St. Ignatius founded the practice of modern psychology. So although it's not quite what you're saying, it's coming from a slightly different angle, is that things like discernment, the exam from all that sort of stuff, that I've been quite impressed that, very scientific texts on the practice of psychotherapy have all said, well, this is what we do, this is what we practice. Now, it points in a different direction to theory, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's a good point. Thank you. I think I want to distinguish, I wouldn't want to say that there are no functions that empirical research, I'm specifically asking about whether they can affect doctrinal claims. as in, and there are lots of reasons to want to do empirical research on human beings and what they do in churches and what they do, what's happening in their brains when they're having a spiritual experience, and you name it. Yeah, the like cognitive effects of spiritual practices, those sorts of things. But I don't think those are connected epistemically to the question of whether they can prove or disprove or verify or not verify a doctrine. I will say I actually am working quite a lot on mental health material right now for my book, and I've been genuinely shocked to realize how little we know about underlying mental health pathology, as in etiologically, as in what's actually causing the symptoms that are very real, and how we classify them is much more pragmatic than I would have thought. But doesn't mean it always will.
Can we go online?
Yeah, I know. Thanks very much, Simeon, for your talk. So I've got a few online questions here. We'll just do the first one, which is a sort of quite a practical application question, really. So in school curricula, the science and theology RE departments often do very little work together, have little understanding of ways of knowing from the other, which clearly translates into your work. What things would be helpful in schools' approach to different subjects and their understanding of each other to help with the kind of research you're thinking about here?
Thank you. I think everyone can benefit from doing some philosophy of science. For example, I mean, so it is such a powerful sort of folk assumption culturally that science has a certain, because it does, of course, have enormous amount of authority and power, but we make assumptions about what that means, about the level of knowledge that it actually is presupposed, or the way that knowledge production works in the sciences, that is clearly not the case, according to, experts and philosophers of science and so on. And so just a little bit of education on those kinds of questions, and just being able to say these are asking sometimes a doctrine and a scientific claim, they're asking different kinds of questions. And also to have a case. I mean, these are interesting cases. Like what would be the strengths and weaknesses of an argument against a certain view of the will based on science? I mean, having students think through those kinds of things would be very helpful, both for understanding how science works, what kinds of claims it can and can't make, or is best at making, and likewise theological claims. But so if I could wave a wand, I would add some good philosophy of science to the curriculum.
I'm curious, the examples of theological doctrines that you mentioned were somewhat more complex doctrines, but do you think there's more room for blending social psychology in more modest areas? For example, Martin Seligman, in his book Character, Strengths, and Virtues, he's a positive psychologist, talks about how the world of psychology has basically lost sight of Christian virtues, and virtues being helpful for mental health. And so there's, really interesting studies on honesty, that a clinical trial where people for 10 weeks stop telling lies, and there's a control group and their mood significantly improved, or studies on gratitude or humility and these kinds of things. So then there's Christian psychologists or pastors who use these kinds of claims to help support Bible verses or teachings about Christian virtue. The claim is less complex. I'm curious, what you think about that, and if you think there are areas where there should be more of this happening, rather than, we shouldn't be as cautious as we are, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple of things. So one, I think in a way, there's a kind of concept, sort of a folk concept about Christian doctrines, that they are unrelated to experience. And so, of course, they've always been in dialogue with human experience and human practices, and are connected to, though not reducible to. So the idea that a certain kind of account of Christian sanctification actually seems to work empirically, or has something to offer, shouldn't be surprising. It's only surprising when we think of doctrines as total abstractions that are never involved with experience, which I don't think is the case. I think there's a lot of, I also think psych work in particular struggles from but not having a very thick account of the good side, which relates to things like not having an account of virtues really as such, not even just virtue processes, but specific virtues, that it might be helpful for someone to have. That honesty might be valuable in that kind of way. Is a kind of question you might ask more naturally from a religious perspective or from a religious tradition, and yet proves to have, it's not the kind of thing that psychologists might necessarily initially think to ask. So I think this can work both ways, by the way. I think theology can maybe help surface auxiliary hypotheses or assumptions that are being made in other disciplines. So I'd certainly be very open to that. Actually, the virtue one is a really interesting one because there's a specific debate about the efficacy of virtue accounts in the Reformation, as in the critique of Aristotle from a Protestant side on empirical grounds. So that would be something I'd love to see more work done there, see that interacting with the current sort of resurgence of work in virtue. So thank you.
Okay, we'll take one online first. Can I just see the hands in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we'll take a couple online.
A couple of questions at the same time. So, first one, how can theologians who are working on doctrines or theological concepts identify those auxiliary implicit assumptions that one may have made about such concepts? What are some practical or recognizable things that we can look out for to help identify those things? That was the first question to ask. And the second question was, have you ever thought of doing your own empirical research? Not psychological, but theological empirical research.
Right. I'll try to answer them relatively quickly because there's a lot going on. So the first one was how can a theologian sort of do this better? I mean, partly there's no way other than a certain kind of immersion in these discourses, and it's true of all kinds of discourses a theologian can learn. I'm pro theologians learning about I believe very strongly in the Christian theology project, but nevertheless you can see new things when you look at it from angles from other disciplines, including but you need immersion and you need an expert guide. And that's the other, just trying to do it yourself is very, very hard. I have not myself thought about doing empirical work of this kind theologically, but again, this is something I learned from scientists. Turns out you don't have to do everything yourself. You can have teams of people to generate knowledge, something that humanities people don't realize, but it's kind of it's so obvious you don't even mention it in the sciences. So I'd be interested to see other people taking this kind of thing forward.
With respect to the great analogy of a tapestry, can something be said about an equivalent to Thomas Kuhn's sort of inertial resistance and normal science? Is there a kind of normal theology? Maybe a lot has already been written about this, I don't know.
Back to the kind of more basic truths. So something like Genesis, it says about human agency, it's not good for humans to be alone. C.S. Lewis develops that into the kind of basic concept of abdicating the self. And then there's this... what they called it, they published in 2022, The Good Life, the longest reflection on human happiness, where essentially they say we recount the wisdom, or we scientifically recall the wisdom of the ancients. Interestingly, in that book, they cite every ancient faith apart from Christianity. But I do think there is, as you were saying in front of me, so you were talking about, actually there's so much evidence where scientific study, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a molecular biologist, does affirm some Christian truths that I think most of the public just don't see.
I'll take them in reverse order. So thank you. And I think that's certainly true. I mean, there's just in the last week been the first part of this giant human flourishing study that has come out, basically saying, turns out it's one of the clearest data points is that people who are religiously active are happier on this wider range of data points than previous studies had shown. And so maybe there'll be more interest in learning about what religions have to offer and insights that have been forgotten, auxiliary hypotheses that are bad that contemporary culture is making because it's no longer religiously literate. So I'm some optimism about that. The Kuhn question, the sort of normal practice, which is sort of just getting on with filling out the details of what we already know, rather than the big paradigm shifting kind of work. I think there is some truth to that. I mean, often you get these periods where theology is in huge flux. They're usually connected to historical, the late 4th century, early 5th century. The fact that the great theologians of areas that we still read and write PhDs on tend to cluster in about 3 centuries, maybe 4 out of the 20 available, indicates maybe something where we could talk in those sorts of terms. And at the same time, I personally am just very interested in the way that I think theologians have been doing a kind of abstract doctrinal theology that would work for a while for various reasons after Karl Barth, that just is no longer delivering the goods. And so we do need some kinds of shifts in methodology. If not, paradigm shift is too strong of a word, but you can't just do theology as normal.
Just going to make one point. You would be aware that between
and 70% of psychological experiments cannot be replicated. It's been called a replication crisis in modern experimental psychology. So theology may win over just on that basis alone.
Yeah.
So again, sort of relating to your point, I was wondering whether it seems to me that many of the doctrines you use as case studies are more academic. There's less at stake for people to know whether they're true or not, or whether they can be empirically verified. I have not read the paper on this, but I have been told that someone did a study on does being prayed for you when you're ill make you recover better. And apparently I have been told, not having read the data, that if you are prayed for, your chances of recovery are slightly worse. So it occurs to me that people don't really want to know that, and people wouldn't really want for that experiment to run to its conclusion and get the thing. Therefore, is there a reluctance? Are there reasons not to try to empirically verify doctrines? Is it safe for this because there's less at stake? Is it an academic exercise only? Yes. Should it stay that way?
That's a great question. So first of all, my father studied a German theologian called Ernst Käsemann, and Käsemann once told him that a Christian has nothing to fear from the truth. And I believe that very strongly. So I think if it's true, let's find the data and see what we do with it. If out of defensiveness or fear to avoid what's true is not going to be a way forward for a credible theological system. At the same time, actually, I haven't drawn out why, but I think these are actually some of the most applicable cases in theology. They're articulated in a formal doctrinal way, forensic justification, and so on. But they have massive concrete implications on the nature of what do you preach? Do you preach to someone's agency, or do you preach about their relationship with God? Basic question that every preacher faces: do you have an application or not? And what's its nature is a question that is directly derived from different kinds of consequences of thinking about the relationship between reason and willing in the Reformation period and in Augustine. So, for example, I do think these are actually, I think they're, whereas the Trinity, or I think there are definitely doctrines where it's just not going to come up in the same kind of way. And I'm especially interested in theological anthropology for that reason. That's why I'm also interested in the human sciences, because I think that's the point where it's clearest that there is at least potential for fruitful interaction, but also potential for misunderstanding as well. Thank you.
Well, time is up, and I hope you all go home and have a try at being an empirical theoretical theologian in such a time to be kind in this seminar. And please join me in thank you Simeon Zahl for the seminar.